Welcome to This Explainer. Picture this. You sit down at the bargaining table totally prepared for a fair, rational discussion. But, just minutes in, you get that sudden sinking feeling in your stomach. You realize the person across the table, they aren't playing by the same rules. It's frustrating, right? Inevitably, we're all going to run into counterparts who think white lies and ethically questionable dirty tricks are just perfectly fine tools for competitive bargaining. And what makes it even trickier is that a lot of these shady persuasion tactics are technically perfectly legal, which makes them incredibly tough to just outright ban. So how does it feel when you realize you're being manipulated? It stings, and it can cost you big time. So today, we're going to dive deep into some real-world examples of negotiations to illustrate exactly how to disarm these dirty tricks. We'll show you how to protect your interests, keep your ethical standards intact, and expertly steer things back toward a fair, constructive outcome.
All right, let's jump right in by looking at a massive real-world historical example. We're talking about Sony Corporation's colossal $5 billion purchase of Columbia Pictures back in 1989. I mean, this was a monumental moment. You had this Japanese megacorporation diving headfirst into the high-stakes Hollywood landscape. And as part of this giant acquisition, Sony ended up in these separate, highly intense side negotiations with legendary film producers John Peters and Peter Guber. The guys behind massive hits like Rain Man and Batman. They were talking about having them run their new film division. Now, this wasn't just some tiny side detail. We are talking about a side arrangement reportedly worth a staggering $200 million. So the stakes literally could not have been higher.
But here's the catch. Peters and Guber wanted the job incredibly badly, but they faced one very real, very massive obstacle. They were already locked into an exclusive contract with Warner Brothers. They desperately needed time to negotiate their release. But rather than just openly putting this legitimate concern on the table, they pulled off a spectacular dirty trick. They deliberately introduced two incredibly complex, totally phony issues that they didn't even care about, and they dragged the Sony executives into an absolutely grueling, all-night marathon debate. Just think about the sheer physical and mental exhaustion involved there. Then, when morning finally rolls around, the producers magnanimously conceded on those fake issues, and in exchange for this totally manufactured generosity, they asked Sony to concede on the one single thing they actually cared about, the timing. Sony, just completely exhausted, took the bait and gave them the month they needed. And this perfect storm brings us directly to author G. Richard Schell's famous Rogues Gallery of Unethical Negotiation Tactics.
Today, we'll be looking at 3 specific tactics from this gallery: the red herring, authority ploys, and the good guy/bad guy routine.
Let's start with number 1, the red herring.
Now, what is really fascinating about the red herring, which is exactly what those producers used on Sony, by the way, is exactly how it exploits deep-seated human psychology. By pushing incredibly hard on all fronts, including completely bogus issues, and then eventually backing down, the manipulators suddenly look super cooperative. They look flexible. They basically manufacture an illusion that makes the other side feel like they've won this major hard-fought victory. And this triggers a really powerful psychological mechanism known as the rule of reciprocity. You know that feeling, right? You feel this deep, almost subconscious obligation to offer real concessions on the manipulator's actual hidden priorities simply because they just gave up something that seems super important to them. It literally weaponizes your own sense of fairness right against you.
So how do we actually disarm this in the real world? Because, let's be honest, most people fall for this trick out of sheer panic, or just a desperate desire to reach a compromise and get the deal done. Well, if your counterpart insists that all their issues are equally important, do not just accept that at face value. Instead, use this brilliant defense mechanism recommended by Professors Victoria Husted-Medvec and Adam D. Galinsky. It's called multiple equivalent simultaneous offers, or MESOs for short. This strategy is pretty much your ultimate shield against manufactured demands.
Let's apply this to another real-world scenario, like an enterprise software negotiation. Say a corporate client claims the price, delivery time, and contract length all matter equally to them. They're deliberately burying their true priority to use it as leverage later. To counter this, you offer 3 different packages that vary wildly across those dimensions, but, and here's the key, you as the vendor value all 3 packages equally. So package A offers premium pricing but a short 1-year contract. Package B is standard. Package C gives a really deep discount, but hey, it requires a massive 3-year commitment. If the client tries to dodge choosing, just politely explain that you're trying to focus the talks productively. By forcing them to look at these concrete options, their reaction is going to instantly reveal what truly drives the deal for them. If they immediately balk at the 3-year commitment of package C, boom, you've just discovered their real constraint, completely exposed their bluff, and totally disarmed the red herring.
Moving right along to number 2, authority ploys.
Okay, We have all likely experienced the everyday consumer version of this, the classic car dealership manager approval trick. You're hashing out a price, and suddenly the salesperson disappears into the back room to get their manager's sign-off. But listen, this tactic goes way beyond just buying a sedan. It's heavily weaponized in major corporate and labor negotiations too. Think about high-stakes corporate buyouts. A lead negotiator might suddenly claim they actually lack final authority and need to take the agreed-upon terms back to some elusive board of directors. When they finally return with that approval, almost always with some minor final demand conveniently attached, the implied endorsement of a higher authority creates this massive wave of psychological relief. It actually tricks you into feeling grateful, and that makes you way more likely to just shrug and accept those mediocre terms because you're so incredibly relieved the exhausting process is finally over.
On the flip side, negotiators might claim authority they don't actually have, or falsely claim a total lack of it. You see this a lot with lawyers, sports agents, or real estate brokers acting as intermediaries. They'll frequently claim they just simply cannot accept an offer because it doesn't meet their client's hidden threshold constraint. But we really have to look at the hidden incentives here. Why do intermediaries do this? Well, a lot of times it's just to justify their own exorbitant fees, or to protect their ego, or to prove their worth by creating a fake, completely immovable barrier that they can then swoop in and heroically overcome. They're using their position as a middleman to manufacture entirely artificial roadblocks.
So protecting yourself from this requires some real structural discipline. You need to secure a clear mandate from all approvers up front, before talks even begin. Ask them point blank exactly who needs to sign off on the agreement. Also, you've got to recognize that an intermediary's incentives might wildly diverge from their clients. There's this classic real-world business move where a CEO realizes the investment bankers on the other side are just intentionally stalling the deal to justify their billable hours. Richard Shell advises that, whenever it's possible, you just bypass the intermediary entirely. Literally, pick up the phone and call the counterpart CEO directly, going straight to the principal decision-maker and asking, "Hey, is this really your sticking point?" often reveals that actually, it isn't. It clarifies true priorities and rapidly speeds up getting to that final agreement.
And finally, we arrive at number 3, the good guy/bad guy routine.
Imagine sitting down for a negotiation with 2 associates on the other side. For the sake of the story, let's call them Tim and Mindy. Now, this isn't just some small-time tactic. It's a structural approach used at the absolute highest levels of power. Think about how former President Richard Nixon and his Secretary of State Henry Kissinger operated in international diplomacy. Nixon intentionally cultivated this incredibly aggressive, demanding persona. He was the ultimate Mindy, while Kissinger played the incredibly warm, super reasonable Tim. Kissinger would basically tell foreign counterparts, "Look, I want to be reasonable here, but you got to give me something to take back to the president before he loses his temper." In your everyday business dealings, it looks like this. Tim greets you warmly, acting like your closest ally, while Mindy hits you with an absolutely outrageous demand, bringing the negotiation to a screeching halt. Then, Tim gently steps in to urge Mindy to soften her stance.
And just like that, Tim feels like your ultimate savior. Suddenly, you find yourself offering massive, completely unearned concessions to Tim just to escape Mindy's aggressive demands. This dynamic is brutal because it ruthlessly exploits our natural tendency to trust people who seem aligned with our interests during a high-stress conflict. It relies heavily on a psychological concept known as the contrast principle. You see, Tim only looks incredibly reasonable because Mindy is acting so incredibly awful. By contrasting that agreeableness against blatant aggression, they manipulate your personal boundaries and extract major concessions you literally never intended to make.
The ultimate disarming mechanism here is actually surprisingly simple once you know what to look for. You just name the dynamic out loud. You might say something like, "It seems like Tim's the good guy and Mindy's the bad guy here. Could we try working together more collaboratively?" Calling it out immediately breaks the spell. Why does this work so perfectly? Because it completely breaks the social script. It's exactly like turning the house lights on in the middle of a movie theater. The whole illusion shatters the second the manipulators realize you see exactly what they're up to. Now, definitely use good judgment here. If they're actually just genuinely mismatched colleagues with naturally different personalities, you don't want to needlessly offend anyone. Timing and tact are absolutely everything for sure.
By mastering how to spot and diffuse these real-world examples of dirty tricks, you can confidently protect your interests and force constructive, fair outcomes, all without ever compromising your own integrity. Always remember that sunlight is absolutely the best disinfectant for manipulative behavior. Expose the trick, rely on your structured alternatives, and stay locked in on your true priorities. Which leaves me with one final question for you to chew on today. What other unethical negotiation tactics have you learned to diffuse in your own life? Think about it, and we'll see you in the next explainer.